Now, on to the horror story of Halloween. Yesterday, former Downing Street advisor Dominic Cummings gave evidence at the COVID inquiry. And not only did jaws hit the floor in the first 5 minutes, by the time he'd finished, there was no floor left. Now, depending on which paper you read, if you're reading one that's supportive of Boris Johnson's, a bit more right-wing paper, for example, then Cummings, the lockdown dodger, squirmed under cross-examination, basically admitted foul-mouthed, misogynistic rants at others within Downing Street. And if you read another paper, say the Mirror, then Boris Johnson led a government of criminal incompetence so callous they genuinely blamed the elderly for catching and dying from COVID because that caused them an economic headache. Now, let's stand back from this for a minute, Ben, and the papers and the politics just for a bit. This was, regardless of how you feel about it, clearly a government that with a depth and a breadth and a volume of dysfunction and personal hatreds within it, it wasn't able to run a tap without starting a scandal, never mind a country, was it? It was, yes, COVID has caused this to come out, but I mean, this was happening long before COVID, wasn't it?
Yeah, so when Boris Johnson took Dominic Cummings into Downing Street in July 2019, when he became Prime Minister, so many of us were shocked that he brought him in. It was I don't want to go back to that particular day because there was just so much going on, and one bombshell after another. Priti Patel becoming Home Secretary, for example, those sorts of things, and that was in the end a footnote for what went on. So we were very surprised he brought Dominic Cummings back because everyone knew what he was like. Obviously, no one knew that 6 months down the line there'd be this once-in-a-century pandemic hitting Britain, hitting the world, and lapping up on British shores. So the whole system, the Prime Minister, his advisors, the civil service, none of it was set up and able to deal with, understandably to a certain extent, because this hadn't happened for 100 years, and obviously an awful lot changed in 100 years. Nobody was ready for it. But beneath the surface, the chaos, the warfare, the internal hatred that existed, it was terrible. And now we're finally, thanks to the COVID public inquiry being chaired by Baroness Heather Hallett, finding out exactly what they thought of each other, the arguments that were being had, the language that was being used. You and I have worked in newsrooms for years, and I think some of those messages yesterday would have made either of us blush.
Well, I don't know about blush, but it certainly made me recognise a few things. And the fact is, anyway, that if you're in a newsroom, you're just running a newspaper. When you're running a government, it's a bit different if you're starting to refer to each other as some of the things that are being discussed yesterday, which we can't really go into much detail. Now, we've got some of the contents of one or two of the WhatsApps, and I wonder if we can put one of them up on the screen to start with. So get in here. This is a message from Dominic Cummings to Lee Cain, the press officer. Get in here. He's melting down. Rishi saying bond markets may not fund our debt, etc. He's back to Jaws mode. Expletive. I've literally said the same thing 10 effing times. Now this is and he still won't absorb it. I'm exhausted just talking to him and stopping the trolley. Now this is Dominic Cummings talking to the press officer saying, please get in here and help me persuade the Prime Minister about what we need to do next, because he is in this mode of being the mayor in Jaws, insisting that the beaches must stay open, basically insisting the country must stay open and, stuff COVID, we'll get through it sort of thing. The shark isn't that big. We don't need to worry about it. Now, if that sounds panicked, it is. Some of the detail is just astonishing. Messages claiming that the Cabinet Office wanted to delay a lockdown because they hadn't done the work and didn't want to work weekends to get it done. Boris Johnson thought his main danger was talking the economy into a slump. Boris in Jaws mode, like we've just said. Hancock was a liar. Mark Sedwill, the cabinet secretary, didn't have a Scooby. Cummings just seemed to loathe all the women in Downing Street, whether they were civil servants or Carrie Johnson. He blamed them for making the Prime Minister do something that he didn't want the Prime Minister to do. And also the Prime Minister was careering around like a broken shopping trolley. Now, like I say, it all sounds really panicked. And if that's so, it's because I think, Ben, for the first month or two, the government, and Cummings included, didn't think COVID was going to be a big issue. They didn't get things in place when they should have done, perhaps a month sooner, even when the Chinese were bulldozing roads to stop the virus spreading and setting up fever clinics, it didn't occur to them that this was going to come this way, didn't shut down the flights from China and so on. Italy goes into lockdown, and they still didn't even email the Prime Minister during his 10-day half-term break. I mean, a lot of this, there's the shocking WhatsApps, aren't there? But there's also the fact that the insistence and the swearing and the fighting is covering up the fact, really, that for a month, when they should have been starting to get stuff in place, they weren't doing anything. And Boris was on holiday, in fact.
If you let's go back to late summer and autumn 2019, right? Parliament's paralysed. Parliament's paralysed by the Brexit wars, right?
Yeah.
Then there's a general election. Boris Johnson gets his 80-seat majority, so you can take us out of the EU after 3.5 years since the referendum of Tory party civil war, the country being massively divided. We go out of the EU in late January 31st, 2020. After that, everyone breathes a huge sigh of relief, right? Even Remainers who thought, democracy must be respected. It's got done. Let's all just take it easy, calm down for a bit.
Mm.
Far away lands, you've got this pandemic breaking out, but it's okay, it's in China, it'll never get over here. And then suddenly it starts sweeping the globe. Unbeknownst to people at the time, already rife in Britain, spreading like wildfire. The Prime Minister goes for a half-term retreat, not actually to his country retreat at Chequers, which is the Prime Minister's traditional country bolt hole in Buckinghamshire. That's been refurbished. Instead, he goes to the Foreign Secretary's down in Kent at Chevenix. Now, every time the Prime Minister isn't in London or is on a break, we're always told Prime Minister always and everywhere is in charge, can always be contacted, blah, 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 etc., which stands to reason. We've all got BlackBerries.
Hard at work. Yeah.
You can always be contacted. What came out yesterday from Dominic Cummings' evidence was they didn't want to contact him. It's not just that he couldn't be contacted because he was on half term. They didn't want to because they thought they were better off making plans without him. They thought he would hamper the plans they needed to put in place. So chaos is reigning. No one is really aware of how to deal with this. Everyone's sort of still patting themselves on the back because of getting Brexit done, to use the vernacular. So everyone's feeling quite smug about that, completely ignoring what is coming across Europe and heading for British shores is already here in reality. We just don't even know it at that time. So the plans aren't put in place. Dominic Cummings refers to him as the shopping trolley, veering off in one direction after another. I mean, if a shopping trolley works, it does stay actually going in straight lines. I'm not sure the analogy has ever worked, but there we are. A broken shopping trolley might be better. But yeah, he's contacting the Director of Communications, Lee Cain, who, bear in mind, he is an advisor, but he's supposed to advise on communications. He's not there to advise on closing borders, stopping flights from Beijing, that sort of thing. He's there on how to say how it would look to the public and how you're going to communicate that message, not actually the substance of it. Meanwhile, filthy messages are going back and forth, with misogynistic terms, berating the civil service, effing and blinding about other advisors, other ministers. It was the entire chaos of just reigning in Downing Street at the time, all the time. They're supposed to be building our defences for something that is already here.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't seem likely. What does seem to have come out is that, like you say, Lee Cain, whose job it was to communicate government policy, and Dominic Cummings and everybody else is basically having to babysit a toddler, and they are themselves toddlers. They're not, any of them, acting with maturity or dignity or respect even for the job they're doing and the role they're fulfilling. I mean, what do you think, everybody? Do you feel that this is the kind of government you voted for? Do you feel that Boris Johnson had a point in anything that he was saying? Or are you, has somehow these WhatsApp messages and this inquiry, is it lifting the scales a bit from your eyes? Get into the comments and let us know. What impact do you think this had on the COVID care that you or your loved ones had as well? Mike says it's quite surprising how senior journalists who were very close to number 10 when Johnson was there as COVID broke now seem astonished at the chaos. I don't know who you're thinking of, Mike. I suspect it's one or two people who might work for the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail. Did they trade access for favourable coverage? This is the kind of thing that's often said about journalists, isn't it, Ben? And often those who sort of work in the lobby, like you do, and that somehow or another that you sort of promote somebody in return for actually getting some kind of access to them. There is a bit of a trade-off when you're a specialist of any sort, that you need to get in there and you need people's goodwill. And occasionally you do stroke an ego here and there, or I find that I do, but I certainly don't sell my soul in order to, get someone to talk to me in future. I usually insist that I'm going to tell the truth and try and earn their respect that way. I mean, how do you feel that played out during COVID and with some of your colleagues on right-wing papers? Are they, as Mike suggested, overlooking these things and trading access and coverage, or are people genuinely sort of quite surprised and shocked to find out what was really going on?
Within mainstream media, and I would obviously include myself in that and most of the lobby, no, you don't sacrifice principles to ignore a story or big someone up or look after your contacts, that sort of thing. Everyone knows there's a story at which point you'll have to burn your contact. This living in the real world. On the extremities, both the far left and the hard right, hard left, hard right, you have journalists, massage journalists, and I'm going to put that in inverted commas, journalists, fans with notepads, and some of them do.
Someone whose words regularly appear in a journal, but perhaps don't have quite the same rigor as, say, news reporters.
You do have fans with notebooks who will go and write what they're told by a politician on the hard left or on the hard right. Now, I don't take that seriously. Most respected, if you like, reporters wouldn't. We do have a go. Like, the Mirror is often critical of stuff that Labour is doing. We're currently trying to press for free school meals to go into the Labour manifesto. Labour hierarchy is not happy about that. They don't want to do it. So it's not the case that even as a Labour supporting newspaper, we agree with everything that party does. Telegraph doesn't agree with everything the Conservatives do. Mail doesn't agree with everything the Conservatives do. And there's one other thing that I think is worth highlighting from Lee Cain's evidence yesterday, and just the evidence he gave from the box as opposed to written, the WhatsApps that were exposed. I don't think Lee Cain actually came out of it that badly yesterday. Obviously, if he hadn't been followed by Dominic Cummings, he might have looked a bit worse. But there was one thing he said, which I found very revealing, right? He said Boris Johnson didn't have the skill set to be Prime Minister during a pandemic. Now, we all know that, obviously. We knew that at the time. But what Boris Johnson was very good at was a campaigner. If he hadn't have led Vote Leave, we'd probably still be in the European Union. He is a conservative, old Etonian, bumbling posho, if you like, who twice became Mayor of London, Labour London. He's a brilliant campaigner. There's no getting away from that. And that's 2019 majority of 80 that he won for the Conservatives that finally led to us leaving the EU. Nobody else could have won that. But those skills as a great campaigner do not translate into being a great Prime Minister, and certainly not when the country's hit by the worst crisis since the Second World War. Now, when Dominic Cummings has obviously decided as the Prime Minister's chief advisor that we needed to go hard on a lockdown and earlier than one was actually imposed, that was his advice to the Prime Minister. Now, very coarse language, it must be said, but that's one line of advice that the Prime Minister should receive. The Prime Minister does have a duty, I'm not sympathising with Boris Johnson here at all, but he does have a duty to consider not just the effects on public health and the NHS, also the effects on the economy. So if Dominic Cummings is saying the Prime Minister's too worried about the economy, well, that is a balance. Part of the reason that there are no tax cuts coming as the Tory right want, and there's not more public money for spending on schools, hospitals as other people want, is because COVID cost us £400 billion, supporting the economy, the lost revenue and taxation, huge economic slump. So it was right that the Prime Minister not just considered public health and the NHS, but also the effects on the economy. What was wrong from the way Boris Johnson handled it is once he's made a decision, you have to stick to it. You have to decide, and then you have to be 100%, 100 miles an hour in going for that decision. That is the right course of action. Doesn't mean you don't like to still listen to other advice whilst you're doing it, but to give confidence to your workforce, to the civil service, your special advisors, to the country. And the country, we can all remember it was a very difficult time, something that we had never known. People who lived through the war, they'll be comparing it with that. Those of us who, thank God, didn't live through the Second World War, it was unprecedented. So he needed to lead the country and give the country confidence, and he didn't do that.
No. Leslie says people are going to regret voting for him. Will this lead to more people questioning everything he stated as a good campaigner? Now, what you said there, Ben, and what Leslie's pointed out, is that, yes, he was a great campaigner. Lee Cain says he didn't have the right skill set to be prime minister in this particular crisis. But seeing as how he handled this crisis was that he took the advice from the last person in the room every time, and he went from being full lockdown to full anti-lockdown, sometimes in the space of a day. He's more like a weeble, not being decisive, not going one way, just flipping and flopping constantly. And that isn't the right skill set to be a prime minister in any crisis on any day of the week. Never mind. Yes, you need to, like you said, you need to balance the problems with the economy and the problems with people and try and find a way through it. But that means you take advice from different people and you have to be stable and try and figure the route out. But if you're instable and you're banging around like this all the time, you're never going to make a decision. You're never going to be able to have any clarity of direction, and no one else around you is ever going to know where you're going either. Now, some of this is nothing that we didn't suspect, I suppose. But, we had civil servants and press officers who just despaired of him. We got the staff around him all fighting with each other like cats in a sack. No one was really able to do the job they were supposed to. They were reliant on him providing a center of gravity, I suppose, and they didn't have that. He was reliant on them telling him what to do. So who's ultimately responsible here? Is it the Prime Minister then, Boris Johnson, for not leading better and getting a grasp on things? Or is it the officials and the advisors for not really forcing his nose into the bridle and getting the work done that he needed to get done?
The Prime Minister is always responsible. That is his job. As Prime Minister, it's to lead and to ultimately take responsibility. So, if he didn't like the advice he was getting, well, that sucks, eh? But, get different advisors. But if they're just telling you what they think is true, based on the evidence they've looked at, they are the experts in the room. Well, you, as Prime Minister, absorb that information, you balance it, you go across the details, and then you decide. And once you've decided, you say, this is what we're doing, and this is how I want us to do it, and you're clear. And like I say, you can carry on taking advice as you go along. It doesn't mean this is it, you don't ever think twice about it, but it means that you provide that direction so people know what you are doing. And you don't change your mind the moment you hear a different bit of advice, because you decide after hearing all the advice, and then you take decisions and you justify them and you stand by them. So ultimately, only he is responsible.
Yeah, well, Rachel says £400 billion cost, yes, but how much did they waste? Track and trace, the loans were awfully organised. If you don't do the paperwork and the homework properly, then you don't organise things properly. And there's a message from Boris Johnson, which I think went to Lee Cain, his press officer, which just shows how little he did understand what was going on. He said, I must say I've been slightly rocked by some of the data on COVID fatalities. The median age is 82, 81 for men, 85 for women. That is above life expectancy. So get COVID and live longer. Now, let's just keep that up on the screen for a moment. The median age of fatalities may well have been 82, and the above life expectancy, that may well be, yes, for the general population, which I think is about 80, 81. But the fact is that your average life expectancy, right, is affected by the number of babies who die and people who die in childbirth and people who have car accidents and everything else that happens before you get to 80. All right. So there are an awful lot of 80-year-olds who are going to make it to 90, who are going to make it to 100, so long as they get the right care. And just because you're in a care home, just because you've got a chronic condition like a particular heart problem or, a prostate cancer that's quite slow, for example, doesn't mean you don't have 10 years of useful life left in you. And the fact is that when people were explaining average life expectancy to the Prime Minister, he needed to get that the over 80s are still his voters. They're still someone's granny or granddad. There's still people who are either taking a pension or buying things in the shops. They're still active economic units, all right? And there's no reason whatsoever that dying at 81 was acceptable for anybody. Even if it was only knocking 6 months off your life, it's too damn early. It's still knocking time off people's lives. He didn't seem to compute the fundamentals of what the science actually shows, which is just because life expectancy is an average of X, that doesn't mean if you make it past that point, you're winning, or necessarily, because you've got to go further past that point to bring the averages. I can't even. It's too difficult, really, to try and get in your head just how thick this man is. Paul says correlation is not causation. No, the same thing as someone being linked to something else doesn't mean that's what's caused anything. But, we've got certainly a correlation of a very dysfunctional government and then a pandemic that was handled really badly, and it could have been handled better. We've spent a lot of money, as was pointed out. It didn't all get checked properly. It didn't get chased down properly. A lot of people died, and it does seem like the people who were in charge of looking after all that stuff couldn't, frankly, look after their own backsides. So that's the situation that we found ourselves in. Now, very briefly, Ben, Boris Johnson is not commenting on this because he can't, and also because he's going to be giving evidence to the inquiry at some point. Now, when he does, that's obviously going to be box office. But how is he going to get out of this? How can he justify? How is he going to spin or explain? And he's very good at that, remember. He's very good at campaigning, isn't he? He's very good at saying stuff in a way that sounds believable and posh and intelligent, even though it isn't. How is he going to try and get out of this?
I think, so on the live evidence that Dominic Cummings gave, Boris will be able to say, well, he's a former advisor, he's got a vendetta against me, he hates me. He'll say anything, won't he? And that's probably true. There'll be a lot of sympathy with that. What he can't get out of is the contemporaneous messages that have been revealed, some of them written in his own hand.
Some of them which weren't going to appear at the COVID inquiry because he lost the PIN code for his phone.
If I was him, I would say something like, it was a terribly febrile atmosphere, unprecedented, lots of chaos was going on. Of course, there was chaos because this is something that hadn't ever happened before. Certainly not in 100 years. Obviously, the world's moved on a lot in 100 years. So, yeah, you can take a message out of context and it looks awful. What about the X thousands of messages that you haven't published? That's what I'd be saying if I was Boris Johnson. And instead of zeroing in on a particular message that looks terrible, say the overall, well, we did put a lockdown. We did tell people to stay at home for 3 months. We did then have another lockdown later in the year. And yeah, you can pick on this, this, and this, but what about the overall impression? And then he might compare the death rates in Britain with similar countries where actually we come out in the middle. And I think, and I'll be careful here, but because I'm not across the total data, but I think that also includes Sweden, which obviously didn't have anywhere near the same restrictions that we did. And
a very different population, though, not the same health.
So many variables, as you were saying, with that median age, there were so many variables put in. And also with that text from Boris talking about the variables, number one, we know he's not normally after data. He's not a details man. I'd like to know who put the data in front of him, or did he just Google median age death Britain? Bearing in mind he had access to literally the best advisors in the country if he wanted it. And also, when he was doing that, referring to stats, that's quite unlike him, because sometimes he has been able to focus on humanity and real people. And for all that, they were 82, they were going to die in a few months anyway. Yeah, but that's someone's gran. That's someone's mum. That's a grandmother who's not going to be able to see her grandchild for 6 months longer than she thought. So it's quite unlike him. And it did remind me of when, you remember why Rishi Sunak became our Chancellor in the first place on February the 14th, 2020? It was because Sajid Javid, the incumbent Chancellor, refused to sack some of his advisors. And allegedly, according to Sajid Javid, Boris Johnson said to him, "They're just people, Saj."
Oh, yeah. Then, yeah. And then, of course, we ended up with Rishi Sunak, who apparently, according to the inquiry, was going in there saying, well, we can't lock down because they won't fund the markets won't fund it, and we can't do it. So there's economically no reason, no way that we can, so you can't. And so therefore, perhaps even Rishi Sunak has a greater share of responsibility, perhaps, than the toddler that somehow or another ended up in charge of the country. But still, we'll have to see how things go when both Sunak and Johnson have to give evidence in the not too distant future, won't we?